Welcome to Expert Voices in Dementia, where thought leaders from the field present insights from dementia research, clinical practice, and caregiving that will help you maximize the quality of life and well-being of your patients. In this episode, Howard Fillit, MD, geriatrician, neuroscientist, and chief science officer and co-founder of the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, discusses the importance of research into new therapeutic targets to develop next-generation treatments for Alzheimer's disease, including small molecule compounds.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Fillit. I'm really excited to talk to you about Alzheimer's disease therapies. To start off with, could you tell us a bit about your work at the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation?
Well, the foundation's been in business about 25 years, and our sole mission is to accelerate the discovery and development of new drugs for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And to date, we've awarded more than $290 million to fund over 750 Alzheimer's drug programs in 20 countries around the world. And we've helped to bring the first diagnostic tests to market that are currently available in clinical practice for Alzheimer's, which have been major breakthroughs and actually enabled the approval of the first disease-modifying drugs for Alzheimer's disease.
Why is it important to develop novel targets for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease?
Well, the leading risk factor for Alzheimer's disease is aging. And aging is a multifactorial process involving many different pathways. So while the current approved drugs recently during the last year or two target the amyloid that's so characteristic of Alzheimer's disease, there are many other pathways that contribute to the disease, such as inflammation and metabolic disorders and vascular problems. And so what we've learned from the recent approvals is that these anti-amyloid antibodies that remove the amyloid from the brain actually do work, but they only slow the rate of decline in cognition by about 30-35%. And so it's really proof of concept that we need to have combination therapies targeting other pathways to get a full response and slow the disease down by 100% so that people don't have to suffer loss of mind in old age. And this sort of combination therapy is characteristic of the treatment of most chronic diseases of aging and old age, like diabetes, hypertension, and cancer.
Dr. Fillit, could you tell us a bit about one or two of the novel targets under investigation?
Sure. Well, one target is insulin resistance. So with aging, all of our organs require glucose for energy. And with insulin resistance, the ability to use glucose is impaired. And the brain is the most metabolically active organ, about 2 or 3% of body weight, but consuming about 20-25% of available glucose at any given moment. And so insulin resistance is most dramatically seen in the brain with aging. And so drugs like metformin, which is a drug that improves insulin resistance and glucose utilization, but is also recognized as the leading anti-aging drug, is a drug that we've been supporting for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. Another example is a company called Therapeutic, which is addressing the vascular component of Alzheimer's disease, particularly in the small blood vessels, the capillaries deep in the white matter, where vascular damage leads to blood-brain barrier permeability and inflammation. And so with Therapeutic, they have a novel target that is able to reduce the amount of blood injury by binding to a certain epitope on fibrin and preventing its interaction with beta amyloid and preventing vascular damage.
How are these strategies and these targets different from previous strategies for treating Alzheimer's disease?
Let's just put it in perspective that the leading target for Alzheimer's disease over the last 40 years has been beta amyloid and also tau, because these are the pathological hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. But now there's more interest in the biology of aging as a risk factor, and translating almost 100 years of research on the biology of aging into new therapeutics for Alzheimer's disease. So whereas 5 or 10 years ago, 75% of drugs in development were targeted towards beta amyloid and tau, today 75% of drugs in development are against these other pathways that are representative of the biology of aging. And this is a dramatic shift, which I think is very timely. Clearly, we've succeeded to a certain degree with the monoclonal antibodies to beta amyloid, but as I said before, it's taught us that this is not going to be the cure. The beta amyloid antibodies will be part of a precision medicine approach to the treatment of Alzheimer's disease that will require combination therapy.
How do you anticipate that novel drugs for Alzheimer's disease will be used in tandem with existing anti-amyloid therapies?
There's two ways. One is when somebody's diagnosed, let's say through a PET amyloid scan or a blood test, then we would start the monoclonal antibodies. And once the beta amyloid has been cleared from the brain, you could potentially start the next phase of drug treatment with anti-inflammatories, since inflammation plays a role in the disease, or some of these other targets that we've already talked about in terms of addressing the vascular issues and so on. So I think it could be in sort of a serial fashion where we start the monoclonal antibodies and then add on later these other therapeutics that target other mechanisms. Or the regimen could prove to be that we start the beta amyloid therapy alongside of, let's say, an anti-inflammatory, because we know that inflammation plays a role in trying to remove the plaques, but also being neurotoxic when it's overactivated. So I could imagine a world where 2 or 3 drugs are started at once, or drugs are initiated in serial fashion as the treatment paradigm goes forward, probably beginning with trying to remove the pathology, such as the monoclonal antibodies to beta amyloid, and then adding on the other pathways that are being investigated.
You mentioned that anti-amyloid therapies didn't reverse the Alzheimer's disease, but only reduce the rate of decline. Do you expect that combining anti-amyloid therapies with these novel targeted therapeutics might do some reversing of the disease?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting that even when you remove the plaques and you slow the disease down by 35%, this disease, as you said, continues to progress, which is kind of proof of concept for me that there are other mechanisms involved here. So it's going to take a little while to get all this in order, but I think in the next 5 years we'll have clear paradigms for how to do combination therapy attacking these other mechanisms.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting. Which of these potential therapeutic targets or drugs that you've mentioned do you find most promising?
I think the two most promising right now are inflammation and metabolic dysfunction. As I mentioned, a company called Novo Nordisk, which makes semaglutide, which is commercially available in the US as Ozempic, is actually conducting a very large clinical trial of semaglutide for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. Again, recognizing that metabolic dysfunction and the lack of adequate glucose for the hyperactivity of the brain, which is the most metabolically active organ in the body, using the most glucose at any given time. I think it's a really interesting trial. I mentioned metformin, but also semaglutide is being tested, and there's evidence that the whole class of GLP-1 agonists are associated with a reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease. So there's epidemiologic evidence for that pathway, and I think that could be rather sooner than later a new treatment for Alzheimer's disease on a disease-modifying basis. And in terms of inflammation, Elector is conducting a large clinical trial of a TREM2 agonist antibody to promote the microglial activation towards phagocytosis and removal of basically plaques and tangles and other extracellular debris in the brain, at the same time that it's attempting to reduce the overactivity of microglia in terms of inflammation, which can be neurotoxic. So with the microglia and the inflammation story, we have a very delicate balance in trying to create therapeutics that promote the microglial function of phagocytosis of extracellular debris, at the same time enhancing the ability of these cells to conduct inflammation, but reduce the amount of excess inflammation that can be neurotoxic. So companies like Neurotherapeutic, Elector, Mind Immune, and others are approaching this in different ways, but all with the recognition that inflammation seems to play an important role in the progression of Alzheimer's disease, brain inflammation.
Thank you. That's really fascinating, especially the prospect of using semaglutide. Could you share any other insights into the next generation of Alzheimer's disease treatment, whether that's sort of the tandem novel targets and anti-amyloid therapies, or just general insights into the next generation of how we'll treat this disease in the future?
Well, some of the more early stage programs are directed at epigenetics. So epigenetics is really important in all our cells in the body. The way that DNA gets modified for expression of genes and so on is through epigenetic mechanisms. And with aging, epigenetics plays an important role in pathology as DNA and histones become marked, essentially with epigenetic marks. And so there are drugs out there that can help to treat this abnormality with aging. And there are companies like Iconesio in Boston that are attempting to manage these through histone deacetylase inhibitors. We also have companies that are involved in mitochondrial dysfunction. So as we know, with aging, there's a lot of oxidative damage. And our mitochondria are there to manage that damage. But with aging, the mitochondria start to fail in their ability to manage oxidative damage. And so there are companies such as Treeway, based out of Europe, that is taking an oral formulation of a drug that's used for ALS called edaravone, which is an antioxidant, a very really effective antioxidant. And we're funding that trial we've made that investment in that company to study this antioxidant for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, kind of repurposing what's being done in ALS, where edaravone is one of only 2 drugs that are approved for slowing the progression of ALS. Repurposing that drug in a new formulation, in an orally available formulation, is being used now for the treatment in a clinical trial for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease.
Well, thank you again for joining us today, Dr. Fillit. This has been very interesting to hear about all these new options for the future of Alzheimer's disease treatment and all the different work that's going on. Before we wrap it up, is there any other comments you'd like to make for our audience?
Well, I've been doing research on this for a long time, and it's been a long time coming, but I've never been more excited about the prospects for our field. We have blood tests on the market now that can diagnose Alzheimer's very early. We have approved treatments that are disease modifying, and a very rich pipeline of over 120 drugs for addressing the many different pathways that lead to cognitive failure and dementia in older people. So it's a very exciting time, and I'm very optimistic about the future of Alzheimer's disease treatment and diagnosis and treatment, and even prevention.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking your time out of your day to come on our podcast.
Okay, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you to Dr. Fillit for sharing his knowledge with our listeners in this episode of Expert Voices in Dementia. And thank you to you, our listeners. Be sure to visit theneurologyhub.com for more podcasts in the field of neurology. Expert Voices in Dementia is brought to you by the editors of Practical Neurology.